now we're going to have a panel discussion on creating robust research ecosystems for India. So welcome the panelists. The panelists are Professor Satyajit Mayer, Director NCBS, who is also our Margadarshi Fellow. Professor Balram Bhargava, Director General ICMR. Professor Ashok Venkitaraman, Director MRC Cancer Unit and University of Cambridge. Dr. Shailja Gupta, Head International Division, Department of Biotechnology, and Professor Mike Turner from the Wellcome Trust. I also welcome our moderator for the session, Dr. Savita Ayyar from the Jaquaranda tree. Dr. Ayyar is a research management professional and founder of the Jaquaranda tree. She has been instrumental in setting up the Research Development Office at the NCBS InSTEM cluster. She has also been associated with India Alliance through the India Research Management Initiative. I welcome the panelists and the moderator to please come onto the dais.
So this panel discussion is about creating robust ecosystems at Indian research organizations. So India has seen very significant investments in science, in people, infrastructure, institutions, projects. But there is an additional sort of hidden element which also needs some attention, and this is what we are referring to as the research ecosystems. And really, one of the themes, so the panel discussion today is going to take place over three major themes, which is what are the benefits of having robust ecosystems, how does one build capacity for ecosystems, and how can funders and institutions work together to do so. So as a starting point, I'd like to request Jitu. You're the director of NCBS and InSTEM. And NCBS and InSTEM, the campus has India's first professional research development office, which offers a very comprehensive range of support services, part of this research ecosystem we're referring to. So the office was started in 2010, and clearly there was a lot of thought that went into the office. The management had various discussions, and there was a rationale behind setting up an enterprise like that. So it'd be really nice if you could share some thoughts on what led to the creation of the office.
Thanks, Savita. So let me just take a step back. Before 2010, so before 2010, NCBS was a small institute. It had about 25 researchers. And in 2009, InSTEM had just come into being, and we were foreseeing a expansion in the campus on a much larger scale. And so we believe that in about 10 years, we would be at around 50 researchers on the campus, or maybe more. And in fact, that's where we are at. And we're not more simply because there are certain limitations on hiring. So because of that, the trajectory that we were foreseeing, we figured that if we didn't act to make the research funding and research support a core activity of the institution and not of the PI, we felt we would become out of step with what's happening in the biological sciences. And now I'm going to ask you a question, because we asked you to help set up this research development office. And I think at that point, articulated a few charges, which the RDO, as we call it, was made to take up. So it might be useful for us to hear about what you thought your mandate was, if I may put that question to you.
Sure. So I remember this conversation in the director's office, and there were a couple of dots on a whiteboard. So there was NCBS, there was InSTEM, CCAMP, another entity, and possibly another research institute. That was the picture. And So I was asked to use my experience in research funding gained working at the Wellcome Trust, my knowledge of life sciences, to bring process into a wonderful freewheeling academic environment, really, and make that palatable for the researchers. So the shape this took was really creating a research development office. And one of the first charges was to actually start understanding what funding opportunities there were for, at that point, NCBS researchers, which needed me not just to listen to everyone's scientific ideas, but to gather some information and understanding of the different kinds of funders who are willing to work with an Indian organization. And so one of the key mandates sort of became, how can we make it easy for researchers at NCBS to apply for grants so that they can focus on writing the proposal and a lot of the hard graft is just taken out of their way. And in many ways that became the ethos of the office, which was how can we facilitate science at this growing campus, growing from one institution to a cluster of 3 institutions with different kinds of science, different career levels for the investigators, working with Indian government agencies, with other Indian local foundations, agencies, international organizations, and really broadening the portfolio, the opportunities that the researchers had. So in other words, if a PI would come into my office and sort of say, well, this is my idea, this is what I would like to do, how should I fund this idea? Well, what we thought was that this office should be able to offer advice saying, well, here's the agency you should go to, this is the scheme you should go to, these are the deadlines coming up, and we'll take comprehensive care of this, we'll help you in every possible way. So really lowering the activation energy barrier for the researchers to apply for funding. So it started with that, but then of course over a period of about 8 years, this branched out into many, many directions. So we realized that international partnerships was another major area where we could and we did help. Because again, there is a lot of work involved behind the scenes to making a partnership possible, whether it's at the individual researcher level, institutional level, or larger levels, national levels. And the average scientist does not have the time or the administrative background to take care of these matters. And so having a research development office meant that we could actually support the institution and the researchers in those ways. And then, of course, came the whole sort of post-award grant management, because once there were lots of grants to manage, one had to do that properly. And there was another development that happened at INSTEM, which was part of the campus, the NCBS campus. And that's another question I'm going to bounce back to Jitu now. So research at INSTEM is structured fundamentally differently from that at NCBS. So this needed the research development office to work with the management and the INSTEM researchers in a completely different way, new opportunities for us to support team science. And so that became another large piece of work that the office did take on. So I'm going to bounce this question back to Jitu now about team science and this collaborative mode of working, and what does it take to build an ecosystem like that?
I think there's 2 aspects to that. One is that where there's a background of a serious individual PI-driven science, I think the possibility of driving collaborative programs where individuals work together as teams becomes a viable option, because you not only have a bandwidth of basic science, but you also have groups of people coming together to work on very specific areas. And at that time, when we were beginning in STEM's move towards that kind of an activity, Jyotsna and Vijay were very supportive of this, and also driving this idea that you would build groups of people who would work on key biomedical questions collaboratively, and therefore the institution needed to recognize the power of collaboration and support individuals. You know, and as individual scientists, our motivations until this notion of a team comes along are absolutely individualistic. We're not geared, we don't even think about, we think about collaborations as instrumental in driving our own science, not about solving questions. And you know, it's somewhat of a different, not about solving questions collaboratively. And so I think that culture at INSTEM had to evolve, and with that, a specific funding mechanism had to come about. And there, you know, I must say, you've got colleague Ashok, who came up with yet another way of looking at building a team. And I don't know if you planted that question, but if I can, if I
That's
can
right. We
ask
can
Ashok
ask
to
Ashok.
say something about
Yes.
how he built the team that he drives
Sure.
at INSTEM.
Sure. And Ashok, you have these large programs of research both at Cambridge and at INSTEM. You work the ecosystems in both places, and so it would be lovely to hear your thoughts.
I guess my starting point is this. It's increasingly clear that there are problems, scientific problems that we all contend with, which are beyond the grasp of any individual group of scientists. Addressing these questions requires that you pull together groups that are multidisciplinary, have different talents, and are able to work together to actually solve a major problem. And I think that this is a phenomenon that we're seeing all over the world, and I personally think it's here to stay. I really think that many of the biggest questions that confront us can only be solved by this method. And you heard Boris, for example, talking about the increasing impact of not only the biological sciences, but the quantitative sciences, computing, engineering, and so on. So what does it take to build an ecosystem in which that sort of collaborative science can flourish? It's hard to give a single answer because each problem needs a tailored solution. One mode is the type of mode that Jitu was describing at INSTEM, in many of the divisions at INSTEM, and which I think happens in many MRC units, such as the cancer unit that I direct in Cambridge. Here, there is a mission. For example, at the cancer unit, our mission can be abstracted as follows. What we would like to do is to make inroads into early intervention in cancer through a better understanding of the fundamental mechanisms that drive carcinogenesis, and the use of these mechanisms through the development of innovative enabling technologies to allow us to detect cancer early, to stratify cancer risk, and to intervene early through new methods of treatment or prevention. Now you see that the way that that problem is defined, it is intrinsically never going to be solved by a single group. Yet at the same time, it provides a common thread, a cohesiveness around which many people, clinical scientists, basic scientists, technologists can gather because they can all offer part of the solution. So in a very long-winded way, the first point I want to make is defining that common mission is so important. It needs to be articulated in a careful way such that it is not exclusive, that it does not put a straitjacket on people, making them work on one thing, but it needs to enable them not only to do what they do as imaginatively and as innovatively as possible, but also to collaborate and cooperate through this common theme or common focus. That was the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make relates to my experience in Bangalore, where the mission has been somewhat different, which is to create a set of technological platforms that can enable the use of chemical biology to understand mechanisms of disease and to find new ways of intervention in disease. Again, the focus, I think, is fairly carefully defined, even if I say so myself. But here the focus is on creating a technology platform. And therefore, what you need is a different modus operandi, which is less driven by individual groups of PIs bringing their own scientific problem to a common theme, but rather the integration of multiple different technologies, ranging from synthetic chemistry to structural biology to computational chemistry, as well as cell biology, in the pursuit of a common set of problems. You see the structures are very different, but they're both operating in similar ways, and that's the second point I want to make. The solution to work collaboratively has to be tailored once you have appropriately formulated the problem.
Thank you so much, Ashok. So Shailja, I have a question following on from there. You've had a long career in international relations. Again, collaborations at different levels. Would you like to share your thoughts on the importance of good governance in these kind of collaborative arrangements?
Good morning. And good governance is necessary, period, whether in international collaboration or without international collaborations. When I look at how bilateral collaborations, whether it is with a government funding agency or a non-government funding agency, and I compare our own governance system with the governance systems of the bilateral partners, I find that the two points when governance is concerned. One is the review system and one is the actual administrative funding mechanism. When the review is concerned, I think even the best review systems have a crack through which the best proposals do fall through. And this is across. I've seen the EU review system, I've seen the NIH, I've seen the best in the European countries. And there are various reasons for it, for which I think I can actually write a paper. But having said that, I think the experts in my partnering agencies are more mindful of the critique which they provide, which is missing in India. Our experts do not have the patience or the time to provide critique for the projects. I think it is very important because it is sort of a, what you call a reverse, inverse mentoring of the people, of the youngster, of the people who are submitting proposals. And it is important for reviewers, our experts, to provide a more detailed critique than they normally provide. Having said that, I think otherwise we match. Even otherwise, we do our good proposals do get through, I think, simply because the number of good proposals coming in from India are relatively less in number. And so our governance in that structure, in that manner, is more or less fine. The funding mechanism is something which we are really concerned with because our administrative system is a little more complicated than the funding mechanism we have in India. We require a lot of documentations. Not that other agencies do not, they do also, but the PIs are more compliant in submitting the documentation. Our PIs are also not so compliant in submitting documentation. I think there's also a sense of entitlement within our own scientists. I really think, so I seriously think that there is a sense of entitlement within our own system, probably because it is government funding and they think it is an entitled thing and we shouldn't be asking too many questions of the PI. That said, our partners have this pool of funds which have already been allocated for a certain call. And having provided that fund, there are very minimal questions from the IFT how the program manager wants to use that fund. We do not have that flexibility. We are very much answerable to our financial division, even though we give out a call saying this is the amount of money which we will have for that call. And that is why, you know, structures like the DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance are helpful for us. One, because they have the flexibility and independence of doing what they want to do. And second, they can also hire more people than the government of India can do. And like Jitu just said that hiring is a problem within the government. And within the funding agency, whether it's the Department of Biotechnology or the Department of Science and Technology, we are completely understaffed, we are stretched, and we are overworked. And there's only this much you can manage a research project when you are overworked. So I think that's why we should be setting up more independent funding structures which allow better research management within a government structure as well.
Just to pick up on a point over there, are there any institutional structures or any institutional processes where you feel that it makes it easier? It's not working.
Hello? So there's obviously what happens at the funding agencies, but then the institutions are putting proposals through to the funding agencies. So are there any institutional processes that you regard as being particularly helpful in...
Savita, you guys are getting me started, and I'm going to say very many undiplomatic things which I shouldn't be saying. I really think there is a lot of processes which need to be set up within funding agencies. I've been saying this time and again, our processes are so individual driven. If I am interested in funding a program, I can fund it within 2 weeks. If I'm not, I can delay it for as more as 2 years. We can be slothful, we can be very active, and we are not accountable. And truly speaking. And we really need to set up processes in place. And it's so individual driven, and I've been saying this to our secretaries time and again, that it's all very well to talk about science, but you people have not, and I think Dr. Venkitaraman dislikes it when I say you people. I think you people have not really put in their minds in improving the processes of the funding. I think Dr. Rajiv Sharma is here, and I saw him. He was heading SUB, and I think even there we have managed to mess it up a little bit. And we really need to have structures in place and processes. It cannot be individual driven. It cannot be, an organization cannot be driven.
So maybe this is a theme we could come back to later during with the questions as to how funders and institutions. Ashok, you wanted to say something.
I wondered if I could just take the opportunity to follow up with a question to Shailja, because you...
No, this is not for anyone to get hammered.
I was very interested in a point that you made, which has also been my experience of a big difference between the UK funding system and that in the DBT, which is what you mentioned, and if I can paraphrase that to say, almost a subordination of the scientific process to a financial process. This is not something that I've encountered in the UK, where, for example, the finance division might come back and say, we've authorized this item of equipment, now tell us where you're going to house it, how big the footprint is. I've never had financial people without a scientific background asking me questions like that, but I do get that from the DBT. And I wondered what you thought of this process and whether there was any prospect for changing it. Do you think it's necessary?
I wouldn't go as far as saying that we're secondary to financial requirements. We do recommend projects, and it comes from the expert committees, and finance does not turn down a project. They do play around with the budget, however. And that is also, again, an intrinsic systemic problem. And there have to be checks and balances. And because the systems haven't been put into place, the finance has to put in those checks and balances. And we have had instances where even the PI hasn't put in too much thought in his budget requirement. Very, very, very slothful job, I must say. And also as a government organization, we have to be more careful about. So it is not really, I wouldn't say it's a problem in isolation, it's a collective problem, right from the scientists to the governance and to the financial. And I think deep thought needs to go into how do we restructure our whole scientific research governance. And this, like Savita says, really needs another
Okay,
detailed
thank you so
discussion.
much. Thank you so much, judges. So, on that note, Mike, I'm going to ask you a few questions. So, you're a trustee of the India Alliance, and would you like to share some thoughts on why the Wellcome Trust and the India Alliance have decided to focus on building research ecosystems in India? How this has come about as one of the strands of work through the India Alliance?
Okay, I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I take no credit for this whatsoever. This was decided about 12 years ago by, I was still just a mere, an academic in a regional university in the UK at that time. What I believe happened was that people at Wellcome wanted to internationalize what they did, which is a good thing. They then looked literally a very, very simple, crude way at different geographies of the world and worked out a combination of where would the chance to get most bang for the buck and where would be a most potentially supportive environment and where's the potential for greatest growth. And somebody came along with a decision we really ought to go and talk to people in India. And those of you here at Monday then got this wonderful anecdote about people barging into each other, drinking glasses of red wine. And the more red wine was drunk, the better the deal got. And I'm really going to go back to the UK and see if I get the same version of the story from the other side of the equation. So there are many elements to any ecosystem. And the most important element to this ecosystem is you lot. It's not anyone on this stage, trust me. We have our roles to play. And if you're under 50, your role is greater than if you're over 50. I'm allowed to say that. Most of you under 50 are not. But it's true. But we all have different roles to play. And an illustration comes from this little exchange here. So when I was an academic, I put in routine grants for the stuff to do in my own lab. Finance backed off and just let me get on with it. It was great. When I and a friend came up with a cunning plan for a £30 million bid, finance were all over us like a rash because they had no option. Because the way UK university ecosystem works is financially it's all about cash flow. And in an organisation with a budget, a turnover annually of £360 million sterling, a £30 million bid spread over 5 years disrupted the cash flow in a way that they needed to understand to make sure there was nothing being perturbed elsewhere in the ecosystem. And that's just a little case study of where you have to be careful. And government organizations always have to be more careful with their cash because they're responsible, actually, to you because you're the taxpayers who are ultimately generating the money that actually goes to this enterprise. So, you want me to stop there or shall I keep going?
No, keep going.
Going. Okay. So, I was an academic for 30 years. I understand what it's like, I think, still to be on that side of the fence. But 5 years ago, I jumped to a different side of the fence. So the role of funders, we have a role to play in this ecosystem. And what's quite interesting is you compare funders around the world, and every funder tries to do it slightly differently. And that's a good thing. And what's particularly important in India is that you have a pluralistic funding system. So you always have multiple funders in any particular space, because funders will always try and find their way in the world that is slightly different. And they should, because funders should also try to push boundaries. But ultimately, there are only two ways to fund, I would contend. The first one is what I pejoratively call the pipeline model. It is what we traditionally at Wellcome have always done, as most other funders default to, which is that you generate a machine and you generate a form and you put it on a web page and then people fill it in as best they can and you put it into an almighty great machine, the process, and then out of the end comes most of the decisions, much of the ones you don't want, which is say, thank you for your idea, and no, you don't get the money, and sometimes you get the answer you do want, which is you do get the money. And what drives this machine well is you need to overload it at the beginning. So you generate, typically around the world, 80 to 90% failure rates, because that way it gives you enormous selectivity. So the first role of the funder is to set the bar as high as they can possibly get away with, without overdoing it in the way that NIH currently have a problem where funding rates in some of their areas are now below 10%, where it is, the bar is now set so high that people no longer even bother trying. And that's a problem. And getting that right is a problem. If you like, that's the pipeline model, and lots of the due diligence goes into all the process leading up to making a decision. And once you get the money, you go away and work on it. And that effectively is what we've done on a smaller scale with the India Alliance. It's tried, it's trusted, it's also very cheap to run in the office. And if you're a government agency, as you say, Shailja, that's an important consideration. If you're a charity, it's also an important consideration. We could have spent as much as we liked in the office, and in Wellcome, we self-cap ourselves at 7%. I don't know what the figure is for DBT, but research councils in the UK is typically 3%. So they are very constrained on resource, which means they're constrained in how much feedback and help they can give to you guys sending your applications in. The other way of funding is what I call the enterprise, or is more of an industrial model. And that is, you drop the bar a little bit, and you say, and we want something very targeted in this specific thing, this area, and we will go and help select, and it might be a thematic funding call, or it might be a very directed tendering process, or anywhere on that spectrum. But you can only do that if you define very carefully what the area is that you want to fund. And you can only do that if you first run a pipeline, I would contend, because only then do you actually get access to all the best ideas that are out there in the world. And however many ideas I can come up with in the office, funnily enough, it will be a much smaller number than the several thousand of you collectively can ever come up with. And that's exactly as it should be. So the funders have a role to play, and it boils down to one of these two models or variations in between the two. But the primary role always sits with you. And it sits with you. And I would come back to Ashok. I agree entirely with Ashok. A famous man, Sir Peter Medawa, once said, science is the art of the soluble. Work out what is the question you want to solve. If you can solve it by getting 2 PhD students in a lab with yourself, then that's what you do. And if you can only solve it by building the Large Hadron Collider, the 21-mile ring under Geneva, then that's what you do. You have to work out what the problem is, then you work out how to solve it. And that will tell you how to construct the bit of ecosystem you need to make science go forward, because that's actually what we're all here for.
Thank you so much, Mike. And my mic is working as well. Okay. So on that note, I'll just open it up to questions from the audience. Abhijit, you have a question? Yes.
So being a physician and being in a very multidisciplinary research ecostructure for last 3 decades in this country, there are a couple of comments or questions that I would like to bring up. One is that coming from yesterday's panel discussion of bridging the gap, I think what Ashok said, if there's a mission and there's clarity of vision, then everything happens. You know, you get collaborations, you have a platform which will move forward, and I think the funding also comes. That's not the problem. The problem is, I think, and most of you will agree, is the pain of sustainability. And that is something that, and you know, Shailja, I think the government is very supportive. If the question is great, the investigators are driven. And there have been platforms like the Glue Grants, Sparsh, where people have been brought together. But I think what happens is you get a core group, you train them, you get them on that path, and then you don't know how to take them forward. And I think that's where we need support from funding agencies to be able to do that. You know, the drive and the energy will be there, but we just need that. And that is something, I know exactly where you're coming from, because everything then becomes project mode, which becomes difficult then.
Shinjini, the world over actually have these collaborative partners. And world over, there is no sustained funding from a government organization. You have to bid again and again for competitive grants. And in India, I think our funding agencies are unique in the sense that we still give additional at-cost extensions, which is not so for most funding agencies across the world. And this is a complex question, and I agree with you, and I have been working with my collaborative agencies saying that we have invested time and we have invested funds in a particular project. And if the project is doing well, we should find ways and funds for supporting it further. And I think that is one of the reasons funding agencies don't have much to show in terms of outcomes, because we do not sustain good research, and we have to find ways. And I think in that sense, DBT still sustains some research, but it is a larger problem which, at least internationally, when I want to take forward my international projects into a second phase, I find it problematic because funding from my bilateral partner is not so forthcoming.
Jitu, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, no, I actually wanted to take the point of sustainability to another structural issue, and that is, creating teams in terms of science, in terms of people who are brought in along the kinds of multidisciplinary programs that Shinjini just mentioned, but also in terms of being able to sustain the research ecosystem, creating, say, a research development office that we did, sustaining those efforts, which are also efforts for the long term. I mean, they require a different mode of engagement for funding structures to recognize and also participate in creating a sustainable model. Because if we don't sustain the people who help the processes behind these research ecosystems, the research ecosystems themselves will be unsustainable. Because if you have a good research development office where people have jobs that are renewable, I think they will help create mechanisms to bring funding for the project mode multidisciplinary programs that we build. In fact, that should become their charter. Yeah. So, but how does one create that sustainable model for individuals who are, maybe scientists with a different mode of engagement with science as grant advisors or grant managers? The Indian ecosystem doesn't have any way of support for that kind of a job. Yeah. I don't know if there are ideas here.
That's very true. And in fact, maybe I just open up to the audience if anyone has a further comment on the matter of the support system that's needed in terms of people and operations to, for these kind of activities, and the sustainability issue for the support systems. Please. Abhijit, you did have a point to make. Please go ahead.
So my question is coming from the perspective of a young PI, obviously. So as Shailja pointed out that, having a lousy budget proposal part, and I remember that when I wrote my early career fellowship, Savita, you actually sat with me and kind of helped me that, okay, this part needs this kind of budget, because when I'm writing a proposal, I did not have idea what kind of money I need for a 5 years kind of proposal. So my question is that when we are talking about ecosystem, and I'm trying to connect it with yesterday's discussion about building leadership. So young PIs may need a little bit of hand-holding to kind of bring them into the overall ecosystem. But that, us being a bit individualistic, probably we also want that not to kind of getting overshadowed. So my question is, that kind of mentorship like whether that is needed, like the first of all. Number two, if you think that is needed, that should be left with the individual young PI to find his or her mentor, or it can be a little bit institutionalized, the systematic way, so that they can be helped.
Within the government system?
No, not necessarily in the government system, but maybe institute level, government level, funding level, at different levels.
Ideally, the ideal situation should be something like the DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance. It should be something like that, where people can mentor and work with you to develop projects, work with you to provide the right budget. And like I said before, we do not have enough people within the government system to be able to do that. Ideally, one person will be looking after about 150, 200, even more projects at a given point of time, apart from our other responsibilities, which are immense. So we really have to find standalone systems which help us do our research funding better.
So Shailja, if I can just sort of rephrase that a little bit, we heard from your perspective that at the agency end, the staff already have very heavy workloads and have so many grant applications to take through. And so in terms of Abhijit's question, as a young PI, how much should he be expected to fend for himself, and how much support would be optimal for him to receive from institutions, so either in terms of mentorship from the dean or a senior person, or from an office that has the knowledge of how to iron out these process details such that the application reaches the funding agency in reasonably good shape. So maybe that's the balance. And Jita, did you want to say? Yes, sure.
The India Alliance and other organizations as well runs workshops on grantsmanship, and I think they're not enough. And I think NCBS also has a huge outreach on how to submit grants. And our India Alliance also does that. I think we need to set up most of these structures.
And I'm going to slightly disagree with you. I'm a great believer in self-organizing ecosystems. Go and find your own mentor, because then you might find someone who's actually best suited to help you. And I think there's a big difference between a mentor and a sponsor and somebody who can help you through a technical piece of what you need to know. And that's just part of what everyone's learning curve is in working life. Of course, your institute director has a responsibility and a role here, but he or she does not have sole responsibility here. And some do it better than others, and if you're not in a good one, then become director yourself. It's so much simpler that way. Then you say you're disagreeing with the director. It may take a little while, and you should do it the correct route, of course.
Yeah. Just now you have something to say.
Judy may take a different view, of course.
No, I think it's the institute's responsibility to make it possible, but different people have different needs and different strokes and different ways of solving the problem. So I think the institutions must take on the role of making it possible, but I don't think they can tell you what to do. So exactly, I completely agree with Mike. I mean,
So I wanted to just add to that and respond to what Mike just said. I think that's absolutely spot on, because it's not that the institute, most institutes in India do have some kind of grants management office. They're not as comprehensively thought through or as well supportive of individual PIs as the RDO has become, but they do have them. The most important thing for a young PI is, just like you submit your papers to your colleagues for feedback, you need to submit your grants, not just for the technical ideas, but for actually help in negotiating the process. You will find lots of pushback from your institute office, which has been designated for that, because, as Shailja said, they're slothful and not very well organized. But actually, that is one of the key things that, as a young PI, you should participate in pushing to make sure that you understand what the problems of those guys are in those offices and help them. In your case, you have a burning need to get that done well, right? So why would you not help to make that office a better place for everybody in the institute? Most importantly, the new PIs coming in after you shouldn't have to face the same problems you did.
Thank you, Jyotsna. I think Rashna has a question there.
Yes, so first I think I speak for everyone here when I thank Shailja for being so frank. I also think I speak for a lot of people here. You know, when there is a helplessness and frustration on the part of the under 50-year-olds with the large parts of the system, but rather than a blame game, I think many of us want to see how we can contribute positively to changing the ecosystem. I think Jyotsna answered part of that by saying each of us can go to at our institute level and try to see how to improve things. But there must be much more beyond that, because then having an RDO is an ideal goal that many of our institutes may never achieve in the near future. So what can we do at the individual level? Maybe some people in the panel can suggest what young PIs, the under 50-year-olds, can do to improve things for themselves and their peers.
So actually, Rashna, I'll put this question back to you. I mean, you say that having an RDO may not be an attainable goal. Now let's just look at this. I mean, what does it take to turn your institute support office into a responsive office that caters to your needs? Would you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Savita has been going around doing a survey, and she even came to our institute. I think you've been to about 15 or 20 research institutes and universities in India, trying to figure out what our need is for a research development office and why most of us don't have one. It can boil down to a lot of things, but at least the one that we are experiencing is a shortage in positions. And it came down to what Jitu was just saying about giving sustainable careers to people in these offices. And like it or not, a sustainable career is viewed as, at least in the long term, a job that somebody is secure. And we barely have positions for scientists, so how do you justify a position for somebody who's running the research development office and deserves a salary that is given to a scientist who's running a lab? So these are one of many issues. So that's why I think it's very complicated, but what is it that we can do at an individual level? So maybe the panel can weigh in on that.
How can this sustainability issue be addressed? So globally, grant overheads are an accepted means of sustaining research offices. But so just talking to the community, that doesn't seem to be happening in India. So I don't know, Shailja, if you have any views on that, whether grant overheads on Government of India grants, for example, could be used to support research office staff.
So I agree with Jyotsna that it has to be driven by the institutes. There has to be, they need to see the need for having a research management unit there. And it has to come from our research organizations and our universities. But given that most international projects do have a research management unit inbuilt, and the projects are normally evaluated on the basis of excellence, the impact it will have, and the management structure it has. And I think even for the national projects, I think we should have a management unit built in, so that you can hire people for managing your projects. And that is one way to start with, and then we can talk about sustainability.
Thank you. Ashok, would you have any comments from the CCBT experience?
Yes, which is that, frankly, without the help of the RDO, the Research Development Office at NCBS INSTEM, as a newcomer to the Indian funding system, I would not have been able to manage at all. So the RDO, in my case, was totally essential, both for the grant application process, but more importantly, for the governance issues reporting that followed. So I really think for this type of international collaboration, as Shailja has just said, it's essential to have this type of management system in place.
So then one possibility is, yes,
Sorry, say something about the individual something, the point of individual PIs and what they can do. Because I think that's really absolutely crucial as one moves, say, towards building RDOs in different places. Individual PIs, I think, should build cooperative societies, if you will, amongst themselves to just solve some of these issues, because many of them are common to everyone. And simply by exchanging information, say on the community platforms of India Bioscience or the platforms that already exist, one already creates a reduction in the barriers of all these issues that everybody share, instead of being locked up in your own office and behind your own computer. It's worth reaching out to other individuals who see the same problem, not only in your own institute, but in other institutes as well, at the same level. And I think this is now, at least through these structures that are available in the country, India Bioscience being one, it's a reality, and we should make use of it. So individuals at all levels, I feel, can be empowered.
Can I just add this sort of international perspective? I've got the privilege of working with scientists in many different jurisdictions. This is not an India-specific problem. This is a natural tension I see virtually everywhere in the world. If you're leading an institution of any size whatsoever, do you put the next bit of resource into another PI because you perceive that will give you a greater academic route forward, or do you put it into support staff, which means your existing PIs can actually do more of their core job and less of the administration, which many of us find deeply frustrating because it's not actually what we were ever very good at in the first place. And that's an extremely difficult tension, but it is a very typical tension that I see everywhere, not only in India.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
I think the magic word you just said, research overheads. What makes institutions care about the fact their PIs get the grants? If the overheads are sufficient, as they are, for example, in NIH foreign grants, institutions want to build the ecosystem, invest in them, so they have more money. Otherwise, it's not uncommon for the leadership of institutes to sometimes see small grants as a liability to the institute. When I speak from a very personal perspective here, when somebody brings in a 25-30 lakh grant, the first thought going through my mind is, that's actually a drain on my resources as opposed to adding anything, because it barely brings in any institutional overhead. It builds more stress upon the system. And I really think that in the Indian ecosystem, we need to provide a bit more overhead than we currently do. And you know that even that 5% that's there gets capped off after you hit 1 lakh or 2 lakh. So you have typically these 2 crore grants with 2 lakhs overhead, which at CSR we're able to manage a bit because we have internal resources. But when I think of other institutions, this problem is really serious. And I think you already pointed out, it's about overheads.
Yes.
Can I respond to that? I really think the scientific community should push the Indian science leadership a bit more. I see it becoming more and more disengaged. If you look at yesterday's panel, or the day before yesterday's panel discussion, and you look at the history of India Alliance, there was a lot of push from the scientific community to set up the India Alliance. And I see the scientific community now disengaging from this dialogue with the science leadership. And I think you should engage the science leadership a bit more, whether it's the minister, whether it's the secretaries, and try to get these structures in place. And I think it is a joint responsibility between the science community and the science management people to reform our structure. And you really should push a bit more. You should be more demanding of our leadership.
Thank you, Shailja. Maybe we'll just take that question from Deepak as well.
Can I go?
Sorry, Deepak has a question, yes.
Yeah.
Actually,
last question.
So.
Okay,
Oh,
yes.
yeah. Actually, since I understand that the United Dice Stand is a theme of the discussion now, that we need to unite together and we need to foster the more interpersonal or inter-lab collaboration for enhancing the research funding possibility and its smoothness in striving the project for solving national level problems. So having experienced very well in Germany, I would refer to this DFG, German Research Foundation, as a best example for this. They have a very strong mechanism in place called SFB, Spatial Forschungsbereich, and that is called German Research Group. So where they have official, program where the PI number of team of 10 or 15 PIs come together, contribute A to Z issue, solve the major problem, and they all get funding at the same level, same time. So I think such mechanism, if we can introduce in India, that will solve many problems, and it will also solve the issue of copyrights and the shareholding of in the idea being proposed or being addressed. So I think this is a very important mechanism, which we should introduce.
Okay. A plea for you. Find your own solutions that work best for you. Look at what everyone else in the world does, but don't copy any of them. I know the DFG. I'm working with the DFG on a different program because they perceive that they have weaknesses in their system and they want to change them by moving them to more EU cases in another part of their agenda. Go and cherry pick the best things you find in everyone else's system and form your own system that works best for you in India.
Thank you very much. So I think on that note, we'll sort of bring this session to a close. Are there any final comments that our panelists would like to make? Jitu, do you have any?
No, I just think the two elements of reform. One in being able to create sustainable opportunities for research management, and the other is having the younger PIs literally reach out across institutions and form communities that will feed back exactly the kind of things that Shailja was talking about.
Thank you. Ashok?
I don't have anything to add to what I've said.
I think I said enough.
I think we're done.
We're done. So please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Shailja, Ashok, Jitu, and Savita for a very interesting discussion.